Good morning again, students. Nice to see you. Hope it's nice weather where you are in Athens, Georgia. When I'm talking to you now, you can just think of me being in India, in Kerala, in South India, in the tropics, and there's a big monsoon going on. So hopefully you don't have the monsoon that we're having in South India right now. Okay, so I'm going to turn off my picture and just continue to talk you through the lesson for today, which is Ball's Part 1 on shape. So I'm putting myself to sleep. There I go. I'm gone. Get rid of me off the screen so that you have plenty of room to look at the slides that I'm going to pop up right now. So at the very beginning of this section, please notice that these are the particular items that we're considering today. And these are all the things that are listed in Ball's Part 1, and essentially starting with the first chapter on dramatic action, which is, and we'll get to that as we get to it, but essentially we're going to deal with dramatic action, stasis, obstacle, conflict, and, intrusion. I'm looking ahead. So dramatic action, stasis, intrusion, conflict, and obstacle, ignorance is bliss, and things theatrical. If I were with you right now, of course, I would ask you what you understand by all of these particular terms, but I'm not with you just now. Now, one thing to remember is that essentially in the previous introductory material, Ball talks to you about his views about terminology. And one of the terms that he mentions is thought. He mentions the term climax. And he mentions, there's another one in here, he mentions plot and character. All of these terms Ball mentions in connection with what other people have defined as the process for analyzing plays. What he likes to do, as you know, is he likes to define his own terminology in a particular way, and he says that he's using that terminology in a particular way for a reason, and hopefully we'll be able to figure out what the reason is as we progress through Part 1. In any case, so let's start with the whole notion of what shape is, because he mentions shape, and it would be useful if you could begin to think what he may have in mind when he's talking about shape. I've just pulled down off of the web the Royal Winton teapots and coffee pots and their, quote, shapes. To give you some indication about the notion that shape, in a sense, as some people have defined it, is more or less like a outline. It's more or less like a way of understanding the composition, although not entirely, that you have before you. So in a sense, what he's saying is that each play has its own particular shape, and that it begins to define its shape through its processes of defining dramatic action and stasis and intrusion and obstacles, etc., etc. So we have to assume that what Ball has in mind here is the principal focus of part one is on dramatic action. And so through that, we understand what he has in mind by his definition of shape. And the first of the things that he refers to in the chapter is dramatic action. And he defines it in a particular way. He talks about dramatic action, and if I were there, of course, I'd ask you what he means by that. And he says, essentially, what happens, and then essentially he says, and what causes something else to happen, and then what causes something else to happen. In other words, there are processes of steps that are being taken in chapter one, which leads us through defining the dramatic action of a play, and he terms those triggers, what starts something going, and heaps, what ends that action. By ending that action, he refers to what then begins the next dramatic action in the sequence. So, if we look at this wonderful picture of a woman who seems to be running away from a gigantic explosion, in this we see that there is an action, but it is generated by her attempt to escape from the action that has occurred previously, which is this huge explosion. So we have a sequence of events. Her running away is an action, and the next thing that happens to her will be the heap, and the next thing after that will be the next step that's taken in that dramatic action. And so, in a sense, if you look at, these are online posters for the 3 plays that you're going to see this semester, the posters themselves imply something about the dramatic action of the plays. In the upper left-hand corner of the 39 steps, there's an action that's being taken. It seems that someone is running away from someone else. The man in the brown suit and pants and shoes is running away from what appears to be a policeman in the background. And he seems to be running on top of something. We don't quite know what it is. Ultimately, we do know what it is in the play because it's a series of railroad cars that he's running over the tops of to escape the policeman that's following him. So in the poster itself, it suggests something about the dramatic action of that particular moment, but it also implies something about the overall dramatic action of that play in terms of a series of triggers and heaps. Now, Life is a Dream is not quite so clear-cut. This poster is not quite so clear-cut. But the suggestion here is that this hand, which you see here in the foreground, it seems to be extraordinarily tense, and it seems to be suggesting that the person who is reaching out over what looks like almost rough concrete is in some sort of dramatic turmoil. And on this person's wrist appears to be something like a shackle. And so we have to question this play from the point of view is, does the poster itself help us to understand what the dramatic action is going to be in this particular play? And of course, when we see the production of that, we will know for sure what that was. In All My Sons, the person who created the poster here has introduced a number of things that have to do with the dramatic action of the play. First of all, one of the sons is missing, and perhaps is missing because of the crash of an airplane. At the same time, there is in the backyard of the house where the parents live is a tree that has broken down as a result of a storm. And so in a way, the two things that happen, one which happens offstage, the crashing of the plane, and one which happens in front of the view of the audience, the breaking of the tree, which was associated with that son that's missing in action, suggests to you that the play focuses around issues relating to the crash of the plane and also how that impacts the thinking of the characters in the play. We know that it's a backyard because we have sort of fencing here, which is suggested by the poster itself. So in all three of these posters, there is an attempt, it seems to me, to provide something as a hint about the dramatic action of each of these particular plays. Moving along. Okay, so dramatic action is a series of triggers, and it's a series of heaps. And something happens, which causes something else to happen, which causes something else to happen. And so the dramatic action, the process of the dramatic action in the play is what gives the play its particular shape. So you notice that he does not focus his attention, Ball does not focus his attention on an attempt to try to explain the plot of any play. He talks about dramatic action as a way to understand what is happening in the particular play. And so he says that actions are a play's primary building blocks. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind as you're thinking about any particular play. Okay, and we move along. And here's another way of understanding that process. You have here on the right-hand side a blue figure with what seems to be a, what is that, around his waist. You'll all be shouting out. Farley doesn't know what he's talking about here. In any case, it looks like a big lifesaver to me, and that's probably what it is an attempt to save the life of the person that's depicted here in blue. And as this person is making progress, and it seems to be the same person doing that, up the stairs to the final top, we see, in a sense, a kind of visual representation of the dramatic action, essentially starting with here and working its way all the way up the steps to the very top. And in that sense, we can see a visual representation of what is meant by dramatic action in this particular slide. And Ball, however, referred to these things as a series of dominoes. And he, in Chapter 2, this tells you something about how he regards dramatic action as having, in relying on something happening that causes something else to happen. And he puts a lot of attention on the fact that adjacent dominoes, when they fall over on each other, cause a ripple effect, and then the next domino falls. So we have this first domino falling. Hello? We have this first domino falling, then that triggers the next domino to fall, and the next domino, and et cetera, all the way through this particular series of dominoes. And so this series of events depends on adjacent events happening. And he stresses that because essentially his point of view is that you have to look very carefully at exactly what causes one event to cause another event to happen. And just to give you an example of that, in examining Hamlet, in the past, I've asked students to tell me, well, what causes the dramatic action, what gets the dramatic action in Hamlet going, and essentially people have said it's the appearance of the ghost. And I said, okay, it may be the appearance of the ghost, but what prompts the action to actually start moving forward in the play? And it actually is what the ghost tells to Hamlet that gets the dramatic action moving very dynamically forward in that play. Just the fact of the presence of the ghost does not really lead us to the actions that Hamlet takes in the rest of the play. So you have to know where to look for the most important of those actions. And so here we have actions. Each action leads to another action that eventually all of these actions are going to lead to the very end of the play. We have to get to the end of the play before we know, before we've arrived at the station, if you will. And so here's another representation of something happens before something else happens. Standing in front of the end is a person holding a sign that says the end is near. So in a sense, this shows there's a kind of link between these two figures in this rather humorous little cartoon. So plays start with a definition of, they have to start someplace, and they always start with some sense of establishing what the stasis is. If I were with you right now, of course, I would ask you to define what you understand the stasis to be. Ball has a particular way of defining it, and in a certain sense, he defines stasis as a sort of balanced situation that occurs and usually exists at the very beginning of the play. That balance has not been put out of joint, causing, and in this picture you see perfectly balanced stones, one upon the other. Stones balanced on stones, creating a kind of visual image. Well, this may have a certain kind of shape and style, but it doesn't move anywhere. The only way stasis causes movement in the play and is broken is when something else happens, just as is suggested in the defining of dramatic action. And so that something essentially leads to a reestablishment at the end of the play of a new stasis. So in this particular slide, it says the end is just a new beginning, which is quite true, so that at the end of every play, there's a new beginning of another play that could occur. And that you have to kind of imagine what that might be, and you might be able to define what that new play was. For example, in the play Hamlet, what would the new play at the end of Hamlet perhaps be? Would it be the new regime that takes over the government at the end of Hamlet? Because, in fact, all of the principals of the family are killed, and so a new order has to be established at the end of the play, and that new order could very well lead to a different kind of composition for the state. But the actions themselves, first of all, start with a stasis, and then they lead to the next event, which is defined as the intrusion. The intrusion is the thing that I would suggest, essentially suggesting like this: when someone breaks into a house, they are intruders. And often in the newspapers, the press describes a break-in as an intrusion into someone's home. Well, the intrusion causes a new set of circumstances to happen, in which maybe in this particular case, the owners of the house would find a way to put an alarm system into the house so that an intruder couldn't break in again. Or they might put in an electric fence around their house so intruders couldn't enter their property. Or they might, in fact, buy a dog, a very big and vicious-looking dog, that would, in fact, scare off intruders. But the intruder causes the action to take place. Another kind of way of looking at intrusion is that it leads to other steps that may happen. In the particular instance here, you have the explosion of an atomic device and the creation of a mushroom cloud. Well, if you look at the explosion of atomic devices in World War II that caused the end of the war, you have to say that this was a kind of dramatic and dynamic, although horrible way for the intrusion, in this case the explosion of the atomic device, to create the ending for the war. And so then a new social order occurred after World War II, which a new dynamic occurred within societies, particularly in the United States and in Japan, ultimately in the European states, with the creation of a strong Soviet Union, the dynamic U.S. government and the U.S. military, and ultimately led to the Cold War, which was a new set of circumstances that led to other events, one after another. But the explosion of the atomic device was quite a dramatic moment for mankind and spelled the end of something and the beginning of something else. Okay, moving along. I like to think of the intrusion as being like a kick-starting of an event, so that it gets the dramatic action rolling in a very active way. In this picture, you see what does that have to do with bacon, eggs, and toast, and grilled tomatoes? Actually, it has often been thought that breakfast kickstarts a person's day. So in a way, this is like that. It's something that gets you going in the morning. It's something that makes you become dynamic. Now, I could ask you, of course, what do you all have for breakfast, and does any of that help you to become more dramatic and get your day going? You might say all sorts of things about what you have for breakfast in the morning that gets you started. It might not be bacon, eggs, and toast, I can assure you, because in today's world, people use a whole lot of different things to get themselves going. But think of the intrusion as being a way to get the dramatic action going and away from that sense of balance and stasis that occurred at the beginning of the play. As Ball progresses through part one, he ultimately comes upon the notion of obstacle and conflict. And essentially, these are things that relate to, as he says, relate to the characters and what they encounter. So one form of conflict that occurs is between two individuals. In this case, between the man on the left and the woman on the right. And you could try to decide which is getting in the other's way. Perhaps the guy on the left, because he's pointing, and the woman on the right has got a kind of defensive hand up, suggests that he is accusing her of something, and she's saying, no, I had nothing to do with that. So that conflict is what prompts action to occur between characters. And usually, as Ball points out about obstacle and conflict, that someone wants something, and the way to get it is by talking. Not only just physical action, but talking is how people get what they want in plays. In this particular instance, it shows you a person who seems to be conflicted, rather horrifyingly so. And so a second kind of um, a second kind of conflict that occurs is the conflict within an individual. In a sense, as he puts it on page 30, me against myself. Me against myself. So the person, this particular individual, and most characters, most major characters in most plays, have this as one of the primary concerns of that individual, is that they tend to be their own worst enemy in the situation within a play. This suggests another kind of conflict. Pardon me. And this could imply not just the Indian on the left and the what may be a rancher or a cowboy on the right. So me against someone else. But it could be, you could see a conflict between people of different racial and cultural backgrounds facing off against each other. And so one might define that as me against society. And in this case, it would be like the society of two different worlds clashing, these clashing forces that occur. Even as comic and caricaturish as this slide is, it still suggests that that kind of conflict occurs. We see a wonderful picture of True Blood. I hope some of you have seen that episode or series of episodes on HBO, because there are a number of conflicts that occur within that particular set of series. Often the conflicts are between the vampires and the human beings, but they also are between the shape changers and the vampires and the human beings. And in the case of the character on the right, this is a character who is actually a fairy who has been bitten by a vampire and who is in love with a vampire. And so we have a series of conflicts that go on in this particular episode that are quite exciting and interesting to follow. And in these pictures, you get three of the separate characters that are seen in several of the episodes. Actually, the one on the right is the principal character in most of the episodes. And the guy in the center becomes a major force in later episodes. The woman on the left more or less disappears from the episodes earlier on in the seasons. So social conflict, that is, people against society, individuals against their society. In this case, this is a group of individuals in Cairo who are against the government, and they're taking action, and they're taking action as a group. So in this case, we have me against society and the society in which these individuals happen to live. That happened, of course, during the Vietnam War in the United States, when student protests took to the streets, attacking the government for its policies concerning Vietnam, ultimately leading to a withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam. Here we have another part of the potential conflict, and that's me against natural forces. In this case, the figures that are depicted in this painting on this ship are faced with the conflict with nature. They are trying to survive the natural forces that surround them. And this survival is precarious at best because the storm itself is so great. The sea itself is so rough. And it becomes impossible that they are going to lose their lives as a result of this conflict, yet they want to live. So me against natural forces is one of those incidents that one could have in terms of conflicts. And another could be me against God or me against the gods. In this case, this is Michelangelo's representation of God casting the devil away. And you see that this is a very big, powerful figure here, and that the little figure on the left seems to be shielding herself or himself from the wrath of this powerful force that is impossible to control. Moving along, if I can. Aha. Okay, so whenever one encounters obstacles, they have to find a way around them. And so the individual characters throughout a play, in order to achieve whatever goals they have in mind, are always faced with some sort of conflict with obstacles that stand in their way, and they tend to try to find a way to maneuver themselves around them. In this particular, if you were driving down the highway and a big boulder like this fell into the middle of the road, your question would be, how am I going to get around it? How am I going to get to accomplish the goal of getting to where I have to go? This natural thing came in my way now, and what am I going to do? Last night when I was coming home from rehearsal, the highway, the roadway that normally is open was suddenly closed through traffic, which led me to think, suppose I had been trying to get through to my hotel, how would I get there? Because I know nothing about the territory that I'm driving in, and so I would be totally lost as to how to get to the hotel from where I happen to be driving from. So just like that incident is an inhibitor, this happens to represent the kind of inhibiting situation that could occur for a character. Ball in part 1 also emphasizes the need to keep matters from being told to the audience in such a way that the audience knows in advance, before they come to the dramatic event that they're going to see, they know in advance what the outcome is going to happen to be. And essentially, he's saying that it is better not to tell the audience what to expect, but let them find it out for themselves. That's what drama is all about, is for audiences to become aware of what's going to happen. How many of you, for example, would go to one of the Georgia football games if you knew what the outcome was going to be? Suppose you knew what the outcome of the next game was going to be. Would you be inclined to go see the game anyway, even though you knew that Georgia was going to win or Georgia was going to lose? So not knowing the outcome is what keeps the fans coming to the stadium. And that's why these football games themselves are quite dramatic and dynamic, because we don't know what's going to happen next. In this particular little comic, the figure says, "Have a seat, Kermit. What I'm about to tell you might come as a big shock." And he has before him what am I saying? He has before him a X-ray and showing the hand of the manipulator with the bone structure and the fingers in Hermit's head. And if Kermit knew that he was a puppet, imagine this would not, in fact, be great news for the animator, because the whole point is to bring Kermit to life as though he were a real human being. Does that make sense? Probably not. Anyway, moving along. Things theatrical. Paul in the final chapter of part one, stresses the need to put, he says that the dramatic action, that the most dramatic events in a play are usually connected with theatrical moments in the play. I'm sure that you all will agree that at the end of Hamlet, with the sword fighting scene at the end of Hamlet, that it wouldn't be nearly as dramatic an ending if we didn't have that sword fighting scene. And he mentions some kinds of dramatic theatrical events which cause audiences to pay attention to the dramatic action that takes place. In the lower right-hand corner, you see Hamlet and the figure of Hamlet's father as the ghost hovering over him. Without such a figure, this makes the last scene of Act 1 extraordinarily dramatic. It's one of the great theatrical scenes in dramatic literature. Above that, on the right, is the love scene between the two men in Brokeback Mountain. Because of this is one of those love scenes tend to be extraordinarily dramatic and exciting for audience to see. And above that, Cabal mentions the fact that women playing men's roles can be dramatic and interesting for audiences. And next to that, with the person with the hat, this is a man playing a woman's role in the importance of being earnest. So seeing things like that tend to call attention to themselves and are quite dramatic. The sword fighting scene in the center is a representation of that notion that through such scenes, dramatic events take place that are important. Fireworks are dramatic for anyone in theater or outside of theater. Why else does the 4th of July celebration in Washington, D.C. conclude with a series of huge fireworks displays? And finally, above, people wearing strange and different costumes can be extraordinarily dramatic, too. This is something Paul doesn't mention, but which I'm mentioning to you right now. He also mentions that nudity at one point in time was quite dramatic. In this this is a Broadway play called Naked Boy Singing. It's actually a musical. Well, nudity, it's about a group of men who are nude throughout the whole play. And this is something that attracts audiences' attention to the dramatic action that takes place in the songs and on stage. And this is a scene from Crucible where the young girls imagine that they're seeing the yellow bird flying in the courtroom. And so that becomes an extraordinarily exciting, dramatic moment in Arthur Miller's The Crucible. So we have, in fact, seen a number of these particular representations of how dramatic action works, what stasis is, what intrusion is, how conflicts and obstacles help to define what characters want and how they go about getting what they want, often against all odds, and that keeping the information from being told to the audience in advance is one of the high points and most important things about the theater, is to keep the audience from knowing what's going to happen next so that they sit glued to their seats. And finally, recognizing that dramatic action often is connected to extraordinarily theatrical moments, which is what makes it work so effectively. Now, I'm going to take you, so we've kind of covered in a rather quick way Ball's Part 1, but I want to take you to the web for a second, and because I want to show you something that I want to mention something about. First of all, I'm going to mention I haven't gone away. I'm just trying to copy and paste something here. I'm going to pop up something on your on a separate screen is going to pop up over the screen that you currently have here. And so I'm going to pop that screen up so that I can talk about it. If I can ever get my brain going here. 1 second. Dr. Richmond is losing it. Okay, hopefully this will pop up as a separate screen. Aha, it does. Okay, now depending on what you have going for you, this is the screen that deals with establishing your profile on the wiki website. I want to just remind you about this, that this is extremely important, that I'll be checking this this week to see who has put their name and their profile information up on the screen, but on the wiki, because it's extremely important. I don't know anything about you, or at least I know some things about some of you, but what I'd like for you to do is to create your own profile page so that you can then add your writing assignments to that profile page. And if you'll notice here, this is a description of how you're going to establish that. And what you do is you go up to the right-hand corner here and click Edit before you can create your profile page. And the material that I had handed to you about how to do that, I want to just remind you that you all need to do that. And now I'm going to ask you to close this screen by just clicking the red X in the upper left-hand corner. And I'm going to take you to, hello? Do you hear me clicking? So you should be back on the screen that tells you ball shape and black screen. Now I'm going to pop up another and a separate screen for you to take a look at, which shows you the tentative schedule. And if you'll notice that I may well, in fact, create separate pages for each of these things. For example, I may create a separate page for August 17, read ball part 1, et cetera, et cetera. And certainly I'll do that for Trifles and Hamlet, et cetera. Okay, so you just need to be aware to use this tentative schedule as a guide for where you're going in the course. Now click the red button again and get rid of this page. And calling your attention next to the page on which Hamlet is discussed in some way. And I'm going to bring that up as a separate page for you to take a look at. Excuse me. So when you go to this particular page, you'll see the various, if you just scroll down, take the scroll bar on the right-hand side and scroll down this page. It talks about seeing the RSC biography of William Shakespeare, which is quite funny, and then the short versions of Hamlet, 60 seconds, 1 minute, etc. And then the various questions related to the gravedigger scene, which I want you to take a look at. But first of all, you have to take a look at the gravedigger scene as I've posted it on the wiki site. So each one of these particular gravedigger examples gives you a different way different actors have approached the same set of materials, and how each one of these things tends to give you a different view about Hamlet and the way Hamlet may or should be interpreted. The final one being the gravedigger scene done by the Russian, although the work is in Italian. Click the X, red X, and get rid of that screen. And finally, I take you to the screen on trifles. And I'm just going to post that here. And I'm going to pop it up as a separate page. And you will see on this that it gives you some idea about what I hope you will do when you read the play, and the particular things I want you to pay attention to. And particularly at the end, it talks about the sequence of actions. If you keep scrolling down the screen, you'll see it says sequences of action. And this is sequences from Hamlet, starting at a particular point in Act 4, Scene 5, with the last thing that happens. So it's the last action that happens in the scene, but going from the beginning, which is at the very bottom of the page, towards the last action in that particular scene. And I've tried to put them down in some sort of concrete way so you would understand that knowing what causes something to happen is really very essential. And the kind of work that I did here suggests to you the kind of work you should be doing with every play that you read. Okay, now you can click the red button up at the left-hand side, and you can essentially, you're back to ball shape, etc., with the black screen. And hopefully this has been helpful to you in going through the process of understanding Ball's part 1 on shape. And hopefully when you're reading, you'll read much more into it than I've given you in this short period of time. In any case, have a good day, and I'll see you on Friday. Bye-bye.